We on yet? Oh, we are. We're on. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Quarantini time. It's Quarantini o'clock, and it's a lovely hot summer's day here in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm sitting here at Funk headquarters with she who must be obeyed at all, I repeat, all times.
All times.
See?
Always.
And face immediately with the challenge here on the podcast, Quarantini cast. Well, that's a challenge. I can't even speak properly. That's a big challenge to start with. How do you hold a guitar pick, and pour yourself a special cocktail from a brown teapot all in one go? I'll show you. First of all, you put the plectrum down, and then you try and figure out which hand to use. Hold on. To rearrange it. Oh, blimey. Oh, blimey. Challenges of being a musician in this day and age. You've got to move antique records out of the way and try and pour yourself a cup of tea without getting it all over the piano. Look at that. Dexterity personified. Okay, cheers everybody. And assuming that we have some viewers, yes, we can crack on with some music, which is the basic point. Here we're going to play some, I'm going to play some music for you, whatever you want to hear. Send in some requests. And I always like talking about some of the background to the music. So if you've got any questions about that, New Orleans music in general, or any of my records you're partial to in particular. Ah, that's very nice. And then later on in the Quarantini hour, we have the special new competition we've recently added. And today, well, 2 Quarantini casts ago, it was Name That Johnny Guitar Watson tune. On Tuesday, when Nigel Hall was in, we had Name That Smiley Lewis tune. And today, well, I should keep it as a surprise, shouldn't I? Shall I tell him, or shall I just... All right. It's a Name That Miguelito Valdez tune. I bet you I knew you probably...
Because that's not obscure. That'll be easy.
Ooh. Cool. So do we have listeners, and where are they from? If anyone's watching, yes, tune in and tell us where you're watching from, because that's always kind of interesting.
Seattle, Charleston, South Carolina, Willow Grove, Pennsylvania.
Wow, this is great. This is all in the States. Maybe we've got some people watching from Europe.
Lambertville, New Jersey.
Cool.
Sydney.
Sydney. How are you, Sydney?
No, Sydney, Australia.
Oh, sorry. Sydney, Australia. That's great. Well, we have lots of fans in Australia because they have
Denver.
impeccable taste in music.
Scott Aegis in Denver.
Hey, Scott.
Chicago,
We
Portland,
miss you.
Oregon, Boston.
Well, that's wonderful. So perhaps I'll play a little bit of blues.
Do you want a question?
Sure.
It's a question from Instagram,
Oh, okay, yeah.
which I don't usually do because they go
Mm-hmm.
so quick. So, Joe Mac Music says, "Hey guys, just want to say I'm a huge fan of your work, and I love these shows. Just wanted to know, how did the inspiration come from when you wrote Salty Water?"
Salty Water, I wrote that on my grandma's old piano when I was in England at my mum and dad's house down in Kent in the countryside. And I can't remember what it was really. I was on a bit of a Johnny Taylor kick at that time. I really love, there's a great singer called Johnny Taylor, one of my favourites. And the song doesn't really sound like a Johnny Taylor tune, but that was kind of what I was thinking of when I first came up with it. And it has this nice, what musicians call a half-diminished chord right in the front, which is a chord that leads you to another chord, and I'll show you. So here's the first chord. And then the second chord is, and I love it because it's so loaded with intent that you know it's going to resolve to this. So it holds you in suspense until you get the gratification of hearing the chord that you sort of instinctively knew was coming up. And the chord has that quality. It gives you a message that we're going somewhere. It also tells you where it's going, but in advance. And so when you get there, you get a sense of reward, which is a tool that good musicians use all the time in song composition, even in solos, or even sometimes when you're just singing a phrase. So it's a bit high for me. I should have written in a different key. I should have written in B flat, really. And she said, "How you doing?" She said, "I'm making out fine." This is the first time I've ever played it in B flat, so forgive me if I mess up the chords. And then she said, "How you like to stop on around and see me? Come on over for a drink sometime." She said, "I'd rather drink salt water, salt water, than your finest wine." So that's the verse. It's a blues tune, and I like raw blues with just 3 chords, but the beauty of the blues is that you can make it very sophisticated if you want. And if you do, then you just better be careful at this hip, because you don't want to lose sight of that quality that the blues has. But that's one thing about Johnny Taylor. He used to sing the blues, and he could sing a 12-bar blues with 3 chords, and it would be just what you needed. But he could also sing soul music, which is gets into more complicated harmonic territory. But another thing that worked in that song, and I'll go back to the original key for this because there's some strange modulations, is the bridge. And the bridge of the song was really me channeling Johnny Guitar Watson. He was one of my favorites. And he goes, so there's the verse. She said, "How you doing?" "Oh," said, "I'm making out fine." And then she said, "How'd you like to stop on round and see me? Come on over for a drink sometime." And I said, "Baby, I'd rather drink salty water, salty water, than your finest wine." And then the modulation goes. We had it good, then she blew it. I don't know why'd you do it? But what's done is done. Yeah, and I'm not going through it one more time. I'd rather drink soda water. And now we're back to the verse. When you get back to the verse, we're doing all the bluesy notes, that pentatonic. But it works so well because those colours, when you get to them, are in contrast to what's just happened before. And so that's a trick you can use, and one I admire when it's done well. And I stumbled across this thing, and it just worked. I was quite proud of it, really. But it's when you make a modulation, what you're doing for non-musicians is you're changing key. So we've been playing in C. Stop me, Trish, if I'm talking too long about this.
To tell you that there's an echo on your voice. Do you have something?
Ah.
Yeah, that was a big one. And I listened to it on the Facebook. It's definitely there.
Perhaps I should go and turn it off.
Yeah.
Well, let me just finish. Anyway, bear with me. Bear with the echo anyway. The echo is good when you're singing, but it sounds a bit daft when you're talking. Anyway, so this is just explaining. A modulation is when you change key. So in this instance, we're playing the key of C. She said, how you doing? If I change key to F, it'd be, well, you said, how you doing? Do-do-do. You can go either up or down singing. So that's a change of key. So you change a key, but that's quite dramatic. If you can change key subtly, these are all kind of little modulations. So part of that was inspired by Johnny Guitar Watson. Hold that thought while I disentangle myself and briefly launch into the labyrinthine vaults of funk headquarters to turn off the irritating delay.
Labyrinthine. Labyrinthine would be meaning that Liberace is in there.
Exactly, because it's Quarantini, yeah, it's labyrinthine. Otherwise, ordinarily it would be labyrinthine.
Yeah.
Okay, we got cocktails. Hold on.
And hey, Instagram, there's no echo on you because we don't use the microphones. Instagram is just going right through the iPad. So if you want more camera angles and better sound once he fixes that echo, then check out YouTube or Facebook.
It's a miracle.
And he's back.
Fortunately, I have a team of Sherpas on hand to lead me back. Otherwise, I'd be down there for months getting lost in the tunnels and having to leave a trail of breadcrumbs, which would involve having a piece of bread, which I don't have. I could always have taken the brown Betty teapot and poured a trail of tea, but then I wouldn't have any tea left. Speaking of which... Anyway, I hope that answered the... that was a very good question about salty water. Yeah, really, the inspirations initially were the two Johnnies, Johnny Watson and Johnny Taylor.
Okay, ready for another question?
Ah, fantastic.
Ready for another question?
Always ready for another question.
All right. Matt Wilson says, can you talk about different styles of blues, especially slow blues like Port Street Blues? Maybe how the chords and voicing work together. Thanks. I always enjoy the Quarantinis.
Thank you. That's a good question. It kind of ties into the last one, really. What I like is... I like sophisticated music, and I like really ignorant music as well. Some of my favourite stuff is really, really basic. And there's no reason why you can't include elements of all of that stuff. Sophisticated stuff can sometimes be entertaining for musicians, but not particularly for listeners who aren't musicians. But if you can do stuff that's sophisticated and complicated, and it kind of sounds classy because of it, but at the same time do it in such a way that a non-musician can doesn't lose the plot, as you go through, because you're being obtuse. And that was the case in the one I just played with Salty Water with that bridge, and Port Street Blues is similar, really. So the bulk of the tune is this simple Camelback Riverside Shack, Creole shotgun, little yard out back, the cool breeze and Wrigley's and blowing through. This is where it gets interesting. Up in the trees and major 7, soft chord, rusty freight trip to the minor, the 9, and that leads to this chord here. And now we just modulate it to a different key, and now we're passing, which is a really interesting key. But the next chord is the interesting one. To a sad time of day. And so for musicians out, it's an A flat chord, a 6, and a flat 5, and a 9, and a 7. And now we've kind of dug a hole in, like, how do you get out of that? So the way I go is using a diminished chord. Just trying to tell you about a little. And then there's a number of places you can go, but it drops down here. So you got this dropping down a half step, and you have this dropping down a half step too. So you get this nice parallel harmony. And now we're back in E flat, and then by a process of combobulation and modulation, we're back to the beginning, to C. So it's a bunch of very sophisticated chords, but they have a very logical thread that goes right the way through them. And your ear, it's like you're leading somebody around a beautiful garden. It's like you're taking the listener and gently leading them through a set of very complicated chord changes, in the process of which you forget where you started. You get lost in the middle of the garden, and then you turn around a bush and take a little path, go by the goldfish pond, and then you're right back where you started with. So it's kind of like a little adventure. So hope that answers that question. But that's a sophisticated blues. Raw blues is cool too. You like. So I like playing the raw stuff and then mixing in the sophisticated stuff. But you have to, that's kind of where your aesthetic, personal tastes come in. Just the degree to which you incorporate these different elements to get a blend that hopefully ends up being sort of almost kind of uniquely yours. But you have to know how to do it. I think there's an important thing with music is it's very important to learn as much as you can. And even to learn things that you might not ever even use, but it's better to know how to employ them, even if aesthetically you choose not to use them. There's a friend of mine, Johnny Lee, a great guitar player in LA, and someone once said to him, can you play a major 7th chord? He said, yeah, I could do, but I just choose not to. And that's kind of hip, because you don't have to show off every flashy chord all the time. And when you hear musicians that do that, and I can see why they do it, because it's more fun for them, but it leaves the audience with a bit too much sugar, and sometimes you've got to mix it up with a bit of salt and pepper and vinegar.
All right, this is just a quick question.
Yeah.
Felix Elliott Greenberg says, by the way, what is a Creole shotgun? I know it's a type of house, but still wonder. I was going to stay in one till the lurgy came up.
There's a style of architecture that you see in New Orleans. You see it around the South, but in my neighborhood here, this has the most shotgun collection of shotgun houses in the neighborhood, more than anywhere else in the South, I believe. And I'm not an expert, but I saw very primitive very old, simple dwellings when I was down in Haiti. And they say that when a large number of Haitians emigrated to New Orleans after the revolution, that became a style of architecture that was very popular. And they call it a shotgun house because it's a long building, single story usually, or sometimes it's a camelback or 2 stories. But the idea is that you walk in the front door, and there's one room behind the other, and if you open all the doors, you can just see all the way through out to the garden in the back, and you could shoot a shotgun through the front door, and it would go right through to the back of the house.
There's no hallways. It's just room,
Yeah.
room. Sometimes with just like an opening, not even a doorway.
So that's the shotgun house, Creole shotgun, little yard out back. And that song, Port Street Blues, was about a house I used to live in called Bird's Grocery. I think it's a bakery now. It was a Vietnamese restaurant before. It used to be an old grocery store and had been closed for years. And I grew up in that building on Port Street. That's why it's called Port Street Blues, on the corner of Port Street and Charter Street.
Andrew, wait, which one is it? Yeah, Andrew Gray says, could you talk about your debut album, some of the songs on it, and how it came about? I love Go Ahead Baby.
Go Ahead Baby was... Well, I made that record in 1989. I remember that it was in November of 1989, and the whole record was recorded and mixed in 24 hours at a studio that doesn't exist anymore out by Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. And it came about because I had played a couple of times. My first road trips here were with John Mooney, guitar player called John Mooney, really good blues slide guitar player. And my first real road trips were getting in the van with him and George Porter from the Meters and a drummer called Kenneth Blevins. And we would go and play in Houston at a club called Chelsea's 804. And it was a tiny little place, great club, and then they bought another building and expanded, and they call it the Club Hey Hey. And one time he said, "Hey man, I'd like you to come down and bring your band down. We played here a few times as a sideman with John. We have a first anniversary or opening or whatever, or some special event." And so I got commissioned to put together a big band to come down to play in Houston. So it was the first time I put a band together with horns and percussion. George Porter played bass. Bunchy Johnson, great drummer, who's no longer with us, sadly, was playing drums. Michael Ward on percussion, no longer with us. I think it was David Batiste. That's John Batiste's dad, I believe. One of the Batiste brothers on guitar. Anyway, we had a slamming gig. We'd had no rehearsal. We just showed up, New Orleans style. Got picked up at the airport on the short flight from New Orleans, and went on stage, and I just called out tunes, and we played New Orleans standards and some soul music. And I had a cassette tape from the mixing board that eventually led to me getting a little bit of some money from a record company to do a session. So we took the same band in and cut a record real quick from the stuff we had just played on the gig. So it was a Tyrone Davis tune called In the Mood, Groove Me by King Floyd, Big Chief by Professor Longhair, a Johnny Taylor tune. I mentioned Johnny Taylor earlier on. There's a called Pick Up the Pizzas. Pizzas? Pick Up the Pieces. Go Ahead Baby, that's fine. It's a song I'd written, kind of inspired by the piano style of Booker and Dr. John, really. But it was a time when my piano skills were sort of developing. And so now when I play it differently, because I've spent years trying to get used to playing big tenths in the left hand, which is not easy unless you have giant hands like James Booker. So now I would play the left hand like this. couldn't do that then, so I played it like this. And the right hand went. If you wanna eat my bread, if you wanna drink my wine, if you wanna stay in bed, head on, baby, that's fine. If you wanna ride in my car, now if you want moonshine, if you wanna ooh la la, head on, baby, that's fine. Anything you want, you just let me know. Any old place you want to see, I'll go. Now, if you want to hear the music, play the way I'll play that old time piano like you never heard. What you want, a little boogie woogie, jazz or swing. You say the word and I'll play most anything. You need anything, baby, day or night, you just give me a call, you know, 'cause that's alright. Do what you want, go on, baby, that's fine. Except when I did it on the record, I played the chords right. Anyway, carries on like that.
Well, and the thing is that's on Alligator Lips and Dirty Rice, and for years it was out of print. And then one day we were cleaning up like some upper shelves, and we found a couple of boxes of them, so you can actually get them from us.
The original ones?
We have CDs. Don't we?
Oh, yeah, but
Yeah.
I think we actually do, yeah.
Yeah,
I think maybe
so
it's out of print somewhere.
It is out of print. Well,
is?
because we have all that's left. So
Oh, well, if you want to pick up a rare copy.
rare.
Well, maybe I should save those for the Patreon site. We're setting up a big news. Setting up a Patreon site to be launched in the next couple of weeks. But I think there'll be stuff like that you can get if you sign up to the Patreon thing. And actually, we have a newsletter too for those people who are watching, where I've been sending out a few little tidbits here from the studio that you can't get anywhere else. And that's on when you go to the tip jar.
The stream at johncleary.com,
yeah.
that link.
That gives you a page where you can subscribe to the newsletter, which will keep you updated of upcoming gigs. Not that we've got any upcoming gigs. All the gigs, I think, next gig I think is in August. But yeah, do sign up for the newsletter. Everyone that is already signed up I did a little rock steady version of what was it I did? It's all in the game.
Stuck
Tommy
in our head
Edwards.
for days, yeah.
Hmm?
It was stuck in our head for
I
days,
know,
and
I know.
I can't remember what it is.
Many a tear has to fall, but it's all in the game. All in the wonderful game that we know. It's like a rock steady, for those of you who don't know, is a precursor to reggae music. It's like soul music from Jamaica that grew out of ska, which was a style which was very popular in Jamaica in the 60s, called ska, because he went ska, 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 ska. One of the Jamaican names for the music is onomatopoeic, like reggae, 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 reggae. So in between ska and reggae was rock steady. And the original version, the Tommy Edwards version, is in a time signature called 12/8. As many a tear has to fall, but it's all in the game. All in the wonderful game that we know, called No, it's a beautiful old tune. Actually, it was Bonnie Raitt turned me onto that tune. It was actually Bonnie's idea to cut it as a reggae tune at a sound check when we were fooling around with different things.
Joe O'Callahan says, hello from Cork. Please, John, could you show
Joe.
the intro of Burnt Mouth Boogie by just using both of your index fingers?
I will, on the condition that you mail me a pint of Murphy's. Because I could really use a pint of Murphy's right now. As I haven't got any Murphy's, I'm making do with sort of vitamin M. I've got vitamin T. Hold up. Burnt Mouth Boogie.
Yeah, with just your index fingers.
I can't do it with just my index fingers, but that's basically it. Those notes by themselves, they were kind of like a loose cannon, so I include that to nail it down so you know what the context is. It's arpeggiating in a kind of funky, fucked up way. Oh, I just said a rude word. Sorry about that. Cover your ears, Purdy and Finn and Johnny, if you're listening. It's a C major, D minor, E flat diminished, C major, first inversion. So that's what's going on, basically. It goes by very quickly. And then you do that, which could be a C minor, but you're imagining an F in the bass. So that makes it an F7, the second chord. And then back to the 1. 7th, 5 chord, and then you're all off. Whoa, where are we going now? Hold up. Yeah, if you want to do the very basic version, do it slow. We go like this. It's hard to play that fast like that, though. You're better off doing it like this. Using slightly different fingering.
Jolene Green says, which of your songs are you most proud of? Which do you enjoy playing the most? What is the story behind it? And can you play it for us?
Which of my songs?
Your songs.
Do I enjoy the most? Well, they have an interesting life, songs. You know, they in their initial inception, as you get when you're corralling a few different ideas and finding ways of combining them to make an actual song. They are kind of fraught with tension because until you finally make a decision, they have the potential to be any infinite number of different songs in every respect, from the melody to the chord progressions to the lyrics that you use and to the style that you impart when you play them and voice the chords and phrase the rhythmic stuff. So there's an enormous amount of variety, and ultimately you have to settle on one thing, and if you're the creator of the song, that's the one that gets settled on, but you're always, every time you play them, aware of the other ways that any one of these songs could have gone. And sometimes it's actually quite fun to re-record songs and give the listeners an idea of perhaps what the alternative might have been. But then or at least I record them, make those decisions and record a definitive version, and then you start playing them with the band, and everybody brings something of their own style to the actual performance, and so it morphs yet once more into a different thing. And then after having played it for a while, you think, well, that bit could be better or this bit could be better. And they start to go off in a direction and they evolve. I mean, they have to keep it interesting. But quite often they end up being quite different from the original recorded version, such that even that by the time you get to play them on a gig, someone might have been really digging the record and they start playing it and all of a sudden it doesn't sound like the record, it's something else. Which can either be exciting and interesting or it can be a bit disappointing if you're really married to a particular arrangement. But of my songs, well, the one that everybody seems to like, and I don't know quite why this one particular, but is When You Get Back. We're going to cha-cha all night long. And when I did the original demo, is When You Get Back, we're going to party all night long. Which sounds really naff now. But I remember at the time when I said to someone, I've got this idea for this. What do you think sounds better? When you get back, we're going to party all night long. And I said, yeah, that sounds good. And so I'm thinking you change it to When You Get Back, we're going to cha-cha all night long. And he went, ooh, God, that sounds really? Yeah, I thought that kind of is hipper. Cha-cha.
It is.
I was right, because that's what everyone loves. I think if it was When You Get Back, we're going to party all night long. Well, it still would have been hip, but
it would have been kind of
cha-cha all night long's more interesting. I think lyrics have to be kind of fun and
a bunch of people
bit
have
silly.
Requested it already.
No, they okay. Let's.
Have at it, yo.
So what? Just read out the original question though, because there was a couple of things about it that I've forgotten.
Where did I put it? Hold on, here it is. Which of your songs are you most proud of? Which one do you enjoy playing the most? What is the story behind it? And can you play it for us?
No. Well, the story behind it was getting back after having been rather unceremoniously required to exit the United States for a variety of interesting reasons. I've just dropped my guitar pick. I returned after a few years and called the number of an old girlfriend of mine. Looking forward to seeing her.
What? You had a girlfriend before me?
So, oops, that was a bit of a giveaway, wasn't it? But I would send her postcards on my travels. This is before the internet. No emails. It was old-fashioned snail mail. But I used to take her to see Latin music at some of my favorite Latin clubs. This is when I was living in New York. And there was one particular place that Max, the taxi driver from Brooklyn, told me about. And then Max, the taxi driver from Brooklyn, was an enigmatic character because he would pick me up from my apartment in Manhattan and drive me to my gig at the Alamo in Brooklyn, where I played a solo gig every week. And they very kindly sent a driver to pick me up. But I only ever saw the back of his head and would have conversations with him. He had a thick Eastern European accent. He was an older chap. But I was talking to the back of his head. And whenever it was always dark, so I never really actually saw him. But he told me about this joint, and it's gone now, but this was a fantastic old room called the El Morocco. And Albert Hitchcock used to go there, Marilyn Monroe. And when you walked in this place... Alfred Hitchcock?
You said Albert.
Oh, did I?
Yeah, it's Alfred.
Oh, well, Alfred Hitchcock might have drunk there too. I don't know, but it was Albert Hitchcock.
His brother Albert.
Yeah. Albert Hitchcock was the famous chicken inspector from Brooklyn that used to play the bassoon. Anyway, long story short, it was a funny place, and old people would go there to dance the cha-cha-cha. And there was a band they called Orchestra Broadway, and they played charanga, an old style of Cuban music, which I loved, with violins. And there was lots of elderly, they seemed really elderly to me at the time, but probably not that elderly particularly, but a lot of the ladies had blue hair, and they would dance. It was lovely. And I would take this girl there, and we were the youngest people in the place, and they loved it when we came, because it was like young blood. These are people that are under 30, and most of these people were in their 70s or 80s, I guess. And anyway, so I'd get postcards, and she said, when you come back, we'll go and cha-cha all night long. But when I called her, she didn't return. I've never seen her. I never saw her again.
You got back in the country.
So, yeah.
You called her.
So, she loved me, found me, love. I used to send her postcards from Hong Kong, from China, from Europe, and Brazil. And she said, yeah, all right, cool. Hurry back. When you get back, we're going cha-cha all night long.
Her loss is my game. So there you go.
She loved me, found me, I was riding from Hong Kong. And she dug it even better, calling long distance on the phone. Cool and sexy, getting that postcard from Brazil. Oh, but now back here, back home, all she wanna give me is a cheer. She said, when you get back, we're gonna cha-cha all night long. But she lied, when you get back. So it goes on. So that's the story behind it. And it's got a bridge that... which is a gospel groove. They call it, some people call that a boom chop, boom chop, boom chop, boom chop, boom chop. And so it marries together that feel with an altogether different feel, which is this thing. And these chord changes actually very Spanish. They're the chords you hear in flamenco music. Not that flamenco music's played on a piano, but... chord progressions you associate with Spain, and so consequently, of course, you find them in Cuba. And I'd been in Cuba in my exile. I took advantage of it because I no longer had a reason not to go to Cuba. And I arrived in a Cuba that was just in the beginning of opening up to outsiders. And I was a bit of an oddity down there because people would look at me and thought I must be Russian or Hungarian or Czechoslovakian, or from one of the communist East European countries, because you didn't really see any tourists there. And I fell in love with this amazing place that didn't have any tourists. It was like really traveling in the old romantic sort of Graham Greene, Richard Burton kind of sense. So that song included all these elements, and on those changes you can go... can have fun arpeggiating the chords and playing that style. It's called Montuno, and I just fell in love with that whole thing. But this actually leads me on to the Name That Miguelito Valdez tune. And I'm going to turn the record player on,
all
and
right,
this
so,
thing is...
well, you got to say what it is. It's a contest. It's a contest, and
Oh, yeah.
whoever can guess the name of the song first gets a prize.
I'll hold it up to the camera. I don't want to hold it up
Don't
too
hold
close,
it too
because then
close.
someone might cheat and read the label.
Don't hold it too
But
close.
check this out, look. For those...
Hold on. Can you see the label? Don't hold it up long. That's it. Don't do that. You're going to give it away.
For those who perhaps are younger listeners, this is a record. But a very special record, because this is one of the early first records they made back in the old days. And those of you mostly watching already know this, but for the benefit of my niece and nephews who might be watching in England, this is called a 78. And the reason it's called a 78 is because when you put it on the record player, it spins 78 times a minute. And this thing is probably about 75 years old. And it's from Cuba. Miguelito Valdez.
So if you guess the song right, then you get a poster in the mail.
Yeah, we'll send you a prize, a signed poster.
Actual physical prize.
And this record player is kind of funky, so it takes a little while to kind of speed up. Ooh, there it goes. All right. Name that Miguelito Valdez tune. Is it loud enough? Tell us. So good.
Están pesando los velorios, hay que le hacemos a y dame 17 pelas y pa' ponerlo en
We should point out, actually,
y dame un cabo de tabaco
Yes.
maní
Wow. All right.
y un jarrito de
Well, we have a winner.
y dame un
See,
poco de
got a winner.
dinero maní.
Well, don't announce it till we get to the end because everyone's trying to listen to it. But I will say one thing: there'll be an extra prize for anybody who can write down phonetically and exactly what he says at the end. So listen very carefully.
Quiero pedir, hay que mi negra me quiera, hay que tenga dinero y que no se muera. Ay, yo le quiero pedir a Baja Palo de una negra bembona como que no tenga corones. Ay, pa' que no se fuera mi papá ay, mi papá
Babalu aye.
y esta cara que ni nambo, papá ay,
Whoever can write down what he says in a second gets another prize. Get your pencils out. Got it? Babalu aye by
right.
Miguelito Valdez.
The winner-
Sound of Havana in the 1940s on a 70-year-old record.
The winner is Alexander Shimanovich Burishkin. Yay,
All
congratulations. So, Alexander, I'll send you a message from my personal Facebook and I'll get your address.
Cool.
And we'll send you a poster.
Where's Alexander from?
Doesn't say, but maybe Alexander.
Sounds like a very Spanish name. Obviously, he must be from Cuba. Well done, you guessed it. That's Babalu Aye by Miguelito Valdez.
Well, Felix Elliott Greenberg wrote down Yagabimu Gagabamba.
Oh, it's so close. So close. Sorry. You only get the special prize if you can write it all down phonetically and exactly, precisely. And then, anyway.
All right. Well, speaking of Cuba, I'm sort
Yeah.
of scared to read this question with only 11 minutes left because there was
Yeah.
another question I wanted to get to.
Okay.
If I read you a question
I'll answer
first,
it
will you
quickly,
go
I promise.
quick? Okay, so Carl Franklin, because he asked this question twice.
Yeah.
So he says, how did you find yourself working with John Schofield, and what was that experience like? And then after that, there's a Cuba question.
Okay.
So you want to leave some time.
I met John Schofield many years ago, in the early 90s. I had a friend who was related to him, and I was invited to his house for Thanksgiving dinner at a time when I was living in New York and was pretty broke, and the idea of a nice dinner sounded really good to me. And I didn't have any family in New York. And so I had dinner with John and his family, and he was a really lovely fella. And then our paths would cross occasionally. Years later, we'd bump into him at an airport or at a festival, and it's not as if we stayed in touch. But there was one, I think it was Bonnaroo, the first Bonnaroo festival. I was there with Bonnie Raitt, and in the canteen area, I sat down and John was opposite me, and we had a nice conversation. And then years later, he called me and said, "Hey, look, I want to do. I've got an idea for a gospel project. I'm not quite sure yet, but I'm going to come to New Orleans. You want to come and come hang out in the studio and just see what happens. I said, I'd love to, but I'm out of town. How long are you there for? And he was leaving the same day I was coming back, but there was an overlap of about an hour. And so I came from the airport and I popped into the studio, which was around the corner from my house, and sat down and played. And we jammed a little bit and played. It was fun. And he called me and said, yeah, look, man, let's do it. Make a record and go and do some gigs. Can you recommend anybody you'd like? And I said, well, he said, I'd like a drummer, but I don't want anyone that's plays a lot. I said, well, Ricky Fatah from Bonnie Raitt's band is great. He just plays exactly what's needed. He'd be really good. And we were taking a break at that point. Bonnie was coming off the road for a little bit to take a bit of a break. So, and I said, George Porter's really good from New Orleans. He's a good bass player. So George did it, and Ricky couldn't do some, so we got Shannon Powell, and Roland Guerin played bass, and so and then Terence Higgins joined for a minute. But basically it was gospel music with me and Sco stretching out, and now we've stayed.
Was also singing.
Yeah, and John Boutte. And now John and I quite often we go and do duo gigs. We play in Europe and around the States, and it's just fun. It's just me and him and the tour manager, and we have a good laugh and play R&B and New Orleans funk. He loves R&B and funk, so that's kind of what we do.
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
So you got 8 minutes to answer this question. You'll never be able to do it.
I'll take a sip of tea before
All
I
right.
start, then, just to fortify
So,
myself.
Gretchen Bell says,
Hey, Gretchen.
John Cleary, tell us more about your trips to Cuba, where you went, musicians, and others you met, how long you were there. I have been reading Ned Sublet's books, Cuba and Its Music, and The World That Made New Orleans. But initially, I read a book about the San Domingo, thank you, Revolution. Avengers of the New World by Laurent Dubois. All very enlightening music-wise.
Well, that's a really good book, and he really knows his stuff. And prior to me going to Cuba, I was living in New York, and one thing I had always expected to find in New Orleans, but didn't, was Latin music. You'd expect there to be a lot of Latin music here, but there really wasn't. And when I went to New York, there was, and I jumped in the deep end and stayed there and went to hear every Latin gig I could. I knew where all the gigs were and went out every night to hear Latin music because it was really new to me and fresh. But it was really obviously closely linked to New Orleans music historically. Although I was fascinated by that at the time, this is before the internet and before Cuba had opened up. There were very few books and very few people that really knew. And when I'd go and see the Latin gigs in New York, I'd often be the only non-Latino. Me and there was one other guy, and I kept seeing the same guy, and we sort of became friends and started talking, and it was Ned Sublet, who was getting into the same stuff. He was getting, he spoke Spanish, lived in New York, and was much more deeply into it at the time than I was. But when I had to leave the States, I did what I'd wanted to do for years, but hadn't done, because you couldn't do it legally, and that was I visited Cuba, and I showed up in Havana, not knowing anybody, with the name of a hotel, and got in a taxi, and that was my first trip to Cuba. There was a gig, and I was playing. I got a gig sitting in on the roof of the Casa de Cultura in Calzada Street in Vedado. And who should be there but Ned Sublet? That's really funny. And then, so I was in Havana, and then I was in Santiago, and I hooked up with a really good radio DJ from England called Andy Kershaw, who by coincidence was staying at the same hotel and was on the same flight to Santiago, doing a radio show for the BBC. So he kindly allowed me to tag along and drive around in their rental car. And so made friends in Santiago. And that was the first of many trips. And I fell in love with it so much that I started going back once or twice a year for a period of nearly 10 years, I suppose. And on the second trip there, who did I bump into at the Los Bam Van concert at the Tropical in Playa? Ned Sublet. And so, anyway, Ned came and moved to New Orleans after Katrina. And and has written extensively about Cuban music and New Orleans music, and is an amazing source of information about that stuff, and specifically the thing that interested me, which is the link, the historical, cultural, especially the musical links. And at the time I was interested in that, very few people were even aware of the connection. Even people down here. I asked Mac Rebennack, and it seemed like this is in the early 80s. I was staying at Mac Rebennack's house in about 1984, I suppose, in New York. And I asked him, and he seemed puzzled why I was even asking the question. And he told me about how he used to see Machito's band when they played. I would always ask the old musicians if they had any stories or any recollections. And Idris Muhammad, the drummer who died a couple of years ago, famous jazz drummer from New Orleans, his real name was Leo Morris. We became friends on a tour we did together with Johnny Adams. And he told me about, as a kid, remembering that there were a lot of Latino sailors that were here, because, of course, before the Cuban Revolution, New Orleans was the maritime connection, really, between Havana and the port of New Orleans. So I picked up various bits of information. There was a guy in New York called Vincent Boggs, who's a professor at New York University, who very kindly gave me a lot of tips and information. So I got information wherever I could. And in Cuba, I was struck by so many of the similarities. Of course, in the last 20 years, it's been a popular subject of research, and there's a wealth of literature available now. Foremost amongst the books are Ned Sublet's books. I recommend them. So it's kind of commonly known now that there are links and what the links are. But at the time I first got interested, to find out, I actually had to go to Cuba, and that's one of my favorite places. And we actually played there in December.
December.
And I took my whole band down, and we were the first New Orleans rhythm and blues band to play in Cuba.
That was fun. That was a really great trip.
It was a great trip.
We had a blast.
It was a great trip, yeah. As far as I know, anyway.
What do you mean?
Anyway.
As far as you know?
As far as I know, we're the first. Well, Mac Rebennack told me one time.
It was a great trip, as far as I know.
No, not great. It was a great trip. Well, as far as I can remember, because we consumed so many gallons of Havana Club.
Yeah.
And
Shout
Ron
out
Santiago
to Rick
de
Swig.
Cuba.
I don't think he's watching, but couldn't have done it without Rick.
Yes, we had Rick Swig came on the trip with us and helped to organize it. And cross-cultural journeys, and of course Hernan Lopez Nusa, the famous Cuban piano player, who's now a friend of mine, who I saw on my very first time down there 20, how many years ago? 28?
More than that.
28 years
30
ago.
Maybe.
So, here endeth the 7 millionth Quarantini hour, pretty much. Do I want to what?
And next week.
Next Tuesday, I want to say, first of all, thank you to Nigel Hall, who came and guested. That's as things are relaxing now with the lockdown situation, we're marching in step, and Nigel Hall came and was a guest, and
on Tuesday.
We're going to have another guest this coming Tuesday, and I recommend you tell all your friends and tune in, because it's a phenomenal drummer from New Orleans, a really important person in the history of New Orleans music. I think he'll be in all the history books. Herlin Riley is a great jazz drummer, R&B drummer, funk drummer. He was in Wynton Marsalis's orchestra at the Jazz at Lincoln Center for many years in New York. Very well respected. He tours regularly with Ahmad Jamal. But we've been friends for years. I'm doing lots of little gigs, and I used to play gigs with his great uncle, Jesse Hill, and for a while another one of his relatives, David Lasty, was the tenor player in this band I had for a minute with some of the guys from the Fats Domino Orchestra. Very interesting character whose family history is totally intertwined with New Orleans jazz and New Orleans rhythm and blues, and he's going to come here on Tuesday. I've been talking to him this morning, so that's going to be really interesting, and I'm basically going to be picking his brains and trying to learn some stuff, so you can join in, listen in, and send in questions if you have them for him. So go online and Google him. Check out Herlin Riley. Phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Wait, one more thing. We're also doing a stream on Saturday night that's going to be streamed on the Blue Note, New York City.
That's
at Blue Note
right.
NYC.
Oh, thank you for reminding me.
You're
yeah.
welcome. 10 p.m. Eastern Time on Saturday.
So that's 9 p.m.
9 p.m. Central.
New Orleans time.
Yeah.
3 o'clock in the morning in London, 4 o'clock in the morning in Paris, Sunday morning. Set your alarm clocks. Blimey, it's all going. And we're doing a piano lesson at noon that day as well, so it's all going off. Go to Facebook and there'll be a little poster there with all the dates and stuff. Please visit the tip jar if you feel so inclined, and sign up for the free newsletter. And if you enjoyed the rock steady version of All in the Game, send in a message and let me know. Or if you hated it, send in a message. Actually, no, if you hated it, just don't say anything.
Do you want to play a little before you go, or you just?
Yeah, I'll play a little.
We got a couple of requests.
Okay.
Sometimes I wonder. Go-Go Juice. Don't roll those bloodshot eyes at me.
Don't roll those bloodshot eyes in me. Well, I can tell you've been out on the spree. Well, it's plain that you've been crying. Oh, babe, I know you've been lying. Don't roll those bloodshot eyes at me. Don't roll those bloodshot eyes at me. I can tell you've been out on the spree. I know, baby, you've been lying, 'cause it's plain that you've been crying. Don't roll no bloodshot eyes at me. Thank you, good night, good afternoon, good day, good morning, wherever you are. In Ulaanbaatar or Plovdiv, Zanzibar, Uzbekistan. See you. What's the next one?
Saturday piano lesson.
Saturday noon, Saturday night, live stream Facebook with Blue Note. See you soon. Thank you.